So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name's Sunshine, and I'm the curator at Block Projects. And tonight's conversation, I'm also administering, so there might be some pauses while I let people in the room, or if there's some kind of background conversations happening on the chat. So I do apologize. I'm kind of doing a few things at the same time. So yeah, tonight's conversations between artists JJ Chan and Yuen Fong Ling. And JJ has been working with us at Block Projects for the last 5 months on a residency called Blueprints for the Otherwise. And this week has been kind of a culmination of all the conversations and work that we've been involved with, mostly actually all of it done through Zoom. And through email. And so this was the first time that JJ actually got to come up to Sheffield to visit Block. And the week-long event is called What Do We Know Anyway? And it circles a few of the key themes that we've been visiting and revisiting throughout Blueprints. Those being critical care, reinstituting as a practice, soft activism, and redistribution of resources. And so what do we know anyway is kind of multifaceted. It's a series of conversations that have happened over this week. A lot actually, apart from this one, all the other ones have been done in partnership with other groups and organizations. And all of these different conversations kind of have this similar theme of care, of thinking about reinstituting as a practice. And the one that happened on Wednesday was with Material Pedagogy Futures, which is a new group that has formed between Kingston University, Bath University, and now Block is also a partner. And yesterday we had a conversation between some degree students, or rather the graduates of the fine art program at Kingston's School of Art. And the conversation also concerned what do we know now as artists or burgeoning artists who are entering the art world from an art school environment. And that was a really great conversation as well. So that's a little bit of context of Blueprints and of what do we know now. And so today, our conversation between JJ and Yuen is something that we've been really looking forward to, actually. And JJ and Yuen both know each other, and their practices have intersected in their lives and activism and have also intersected. So we're really looking forward to hearing them talk a little bit. Ooh. Sorry, I'm letting someone in now as well. So I'm going to quickly introduce JJ and Yuen, and then we will hand it over to JJ and Yuen to have a little conversation. So Yuen Fong Ling is an artist and curator based at Block Studio, which is right next door to Block Projects in Sheffield. And he's a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. Yuen has a socially engaged and performance-based art practice that explores his biographical connections with omitted histories, people, places, and objects. Recent projects include Towards Memorial, which started in 2019 and is still ongoing. And that explores the remaking, gifting, and wearing of sandals once designed and handmade by gay socialist activist Edward Carpenter, who was alive in the 19th century. And another project, the Human Memorial, which started in 2020 and is also ongoing, explores the empty plinth to consider what monuments and statues we want in public space, what we stand for, and importantly, when and where. And JJ Chan is an artist working across and amid sculpture, moving image, and writing. At the foundations of their work is an investigation of portraiture and self-portraiture, which seeks new cartographies of gender, identity, and collecting. Through storytelling and world building, their work researches for an alternative space beyond aggressively progressive capitalist time, seeking new worlds from the ashes of the present. So there were a few provocations that we put in the in tonight's event, some questions that are quite specific, but I think what would be good to just start the conversation off is for JJ and Yuen to introduce one another, to share some kind of biographical as well as practice context, and also for all of us as listeners to understand how they came to know each other in the first place. So I'll hand it over to Yuen and JJ at this point.
Thanks, Sunshine.
Thank you, Sunshine.
I was just thinking as you were introducing us, aren't we all burgeoning artists, especially if we're thinking of rising beyond the ashes? And I think that perhaps that's an interesting place to begin. And like, where do we situate ourselves? Is it amongst something that is fully constructed, or is it something that is in ruins? And maybe I'll let Yuen speak about a little bit about his background first, and then I feel like a lot of the people here have heard a lot from me in the last week, so it might be nice.
Oh, thank you. Just to thank you for the invitation, really, to have this discussion and talk about your work in relationship to my work, which is a kind of, it's like a rare occurrence, but really gratefully acknowledged. I mean, I wanted to kind of maybe speak a little bit about sort of some biographical kind of touch points that link to art practice, etc. Because what I didn't want to do is kind of assert any clear position about what Chineseness is in this particular context. So, you know, I was, you know, I'm British born in Salford in the 1970s, and predominantly kind of my practice has been sort of based in sort of the Manchester area and the Northwest area, and only recently in the sort of 5 to 6 years that I come over to Sheffield, having worked here, and also decided to kind of want to sort of live and work here in this particular part of the world. But very early on, you know, I was very aware that I was different. And one of the clear memories for me is me asking the question why I was never Joseph in the nativity play, and why was I always the wise man, one of the wise men. I was always chosen for one of the wise men, and kind of ironically, you know, when I look back on that, I do clearly see that how, you know, someone had made a decision on what my role was within that play, within that staging, you know, when we talk about actors and who gets what kind of role, etc. And, you know, adversely, you know, being a wise man isn't that kind of a negative association. And similarly, you know, I would never be Joseph because I don't have a heterosexual relationship in that way either. I would never bear children. So in a way, you know, it was kind of sort of fitting, but it was one of these rare moments when I kind of realized that I was different, but also that kind of, in a way, to ask a larger question, that kind of society had a role for me. So I believe that, you know, from that point, it was always trying to kind of defy expectation in terms of what I do racially. So, you know, a lot of my family worked in the catering industry. I didn't do that. I decided to be an artist, which is a kind of rare entity in one context. And, you know, still my mum kind of quizzes me about, you know, what I actually do. So, you know, she still doesn't understand. And I quite happily sort of play along with that in this way as well. And I remember as a teenager kind of going into pubs and clubs and stuff like that, and one person asking me if I was a red. And I immediately associated that with, what? Do you mean, what? Are you asking me I'm a communist? And like, but he was saying, no, are you a Man United fan? So it's like so I developed a kind of internalized sensitivity around my race as I was kind of growing up. And, you know, this began to kind of inform how my practice developed across the years. And I did a number of projects where I kind of worked with the Chinese community, working with kind of young people and wanting to kind of platform their voices and their work, publication projects, but also it kind of fed into this kind of narrative that I was exploring my own self-identity through the work of others. And one touch point as well was, as a student, I started to I kind of worked as a life model to generate some income for myself as a student, and then I returned back to that idea at a later point where I started developing works around the strategies of what it is to be a life model, but to kind of invert that process. So this idea of devising a life class, but then inverting it to the point where participants become the subject of the work. So it was about a kind of return of the gaze. So in all of these kind of practices I developed, it was very much kind of nuanced around a kind of a sort of performance of self that related back to my own sense of self and identity. And they had different kinds of expressions throughout my career, which was through, you know, performance practice, but also curating, doing other things in other kind of contexts, you know, working within arts organizations, situating myself outside, and now in the context of working with a, you know, a university institution, and how all those kind of things configure. So in a way, that's my kind of racialized biography in a way, and those kind of touch points in terms of what brought me to this point now. Yeah. How was it for you, JJ?
Well, there's some moments that I really relate to there. I grew up not far from. I'm back in Sheffield now, but I grew up about half an hour drive away in a town called Doncaster, which is quite a large town, and but at the time it felt like a very small town, and most of my friends who grew up there don't live there anymore. There's only a handful that still do, and I remember that the majority of us had always intended that we would leave at some point. But my parents also worked in catering, so I spent a lot of my time in a Chinese takeaway. I worked there when I was a teenager, and so I also remember a point when I realized I was different. I also didn't speak very much English when I went to school. So I was very different from the beginning. I learned my English from the age of 4, even though I grew up here. And I remember the guy in the fish and chip shop being complimenting me on my English when I was like 6 years old, and that I managed to kind of catch up. And I was kind of forced to do that. And then I really rejected my Chineseness. I felt like it had held me back. I rebelled against going to Chinese school on Sundays because everybody else was going to football. I had no interest in playing football. I still have very little interest in football, unless I've got like £10 on who might win. But otherwise, I'm not too interested in it. And but I always wanted to be like other people. And so in that desire to be like others, I realized that I was quite different. And even as I went to university and I was making work, I was, you know, the influences of my artistic practice and what kind of artists I looked up to were all English and white artists. And it wasn't until quite far into being an undergraduate that I started to think back to who I was and who I wanted to be. And I think there was this pressure also of trying to write an artist statement, understand who I was, and I started to kind of rethink that. And so at university, I kind of came to this realization, but I also realized that in an art department in a university, there are very few people who also call themselves Chinese. In fact, there are very few people of color, full stop. And so I didn't have people to bounce off, and I didn't find a Chinese community until very recently, actually. I didn't find people who shared similar experiences when we growing up. I didn't have very many friends who might have considered themselves outside of a system. But I was very popular in school, and I was cast as Joseph at some point.
Damn you!
Yeah. So this perhaps that that gap between me and you being in that position, meant that there was a shift in the way that our bodies were perceived. There was a shift in the way that race was treated, but it was still something that was very visible, and something that perhaps was more consciously recognized when I was at school, that because there were fewer people who looked like me, that I should be the person who was at the front. And I think I found that as I went through education, that I was very noticed, but in some ways, and not so much in others. I fell into different kinds of stereotypes. I was expected to be really good at some things, and not so good at other things. And I was really bad at maths, so that was a surprise. But I'm quite also severely dyslexic, and that wasn't picked up for a very long time.
Me too.
It was just expected that my English wouldn't be as strong. I wouldn't be able to read and write in the same way. So I think that the visibility came in a different, slightly differently for me and you. I was also one of very few in Salford. I imagine there was a larger Chinese community, but in Doncaster there was only one or two families. So I was recognized in nightclubs, and people knew who I was. So I couldn't really get away with very much, because it would always come back. It would always come back to me, and I would always be mixed up with the other kid from the other family. It would either be it'd be one of us. So we'd usually both get into trouble if something happened.
Yeah. So how has kind of race played out for you as an artist, particularly, especially in terms of your encounters with the art world, whether it's curators or arts organizations, etc.?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that it's I don't enjoy speaking about race and decolonization particularly, but these are things that in a way they're not as much as interest, but they're more like essential things that we have to deal with. They are the things that we have to navigate as artists, and I know that some of my colleagues and peers don't navigate them in the same way. They don't navigate those conversations by necessity necessarily. There is an opportunity.
Whether it's also worth my kind of talking a little bit about, I think it ended off where JJ was talking about how race might play a part in their practice or in their development as an artist.
Sure. I think there's been kind of lots of kind of various responses to that process, where I've felt pressured to kind of to make Chinese work because I'm Chinese, and it's how you sort of carefully sort of navigate that, and how sometimes you feel as if you're kind of being instrumentalized because there's a narrative that kind of sits behind the work that you do. And maybe that's something in the relationship between artist and curator. So it's really quite an interesting way to kind of sort of position oneself, really. And maybe that's a different kind of negotiation. And I think we're going to talk about that in more detail in terms of how our responses to the art world have kind of differed since this particular point in time. But JJ, you're there, yeah.
Back. I always found it quite strange to be kind of circled in this category of Chinese work or Chinese artists, particularly because I've never been to China. And I grew up in a very different context, and I understand my understanding of China is from perspective of Hollywood movies, and it's narrow, it's flawed, and it's not from an experience. But I have an experience that is a Chinese experience, which is situated in this country, in this context, in this county, in fact. And I think when we refer to Chinese work, we tend to think of something that is from a different place, and that for me is something that begins to outwardly shape, because we recognize also that our identities are not fully formed by us. They're formed by how we're perceived. And so there's this kind of navigation in the way that we build our identities. And so that is the kind of context that is beginning to kind of shape who I understand I am, but also in the work that I make. And I recognized also that when I was, at least even a few years ago, that I started to, in an attempt to embody those stereotypes, try and break through them, almost to try to kind of out stereotype what people might have expected of me. And so I started being interested in how the Chinese language might be used in work, how our different voices through translation might be used. But these were kind of mechanisms to break an existing stereotype of who I was expected to be, I think.
It's interesting as well, because one of the sentences that sticks out in your letter to CFCCA, your open letter to CFCCA, was, and I quote, "I have felt more Chinese than ever before." It was kind of the opening statement in this idea that it kind of drew out your racial identity by what happened. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, I did. I felt very visible in that situation, but also in the world. It was at the kind of cusp of the COVID-19 the first COVID-19 lockdown, and people were shifting away from me on the tube. And I suddenly realized that my body became something that was worthy of causing anxiety. And I know that my peers feel that all the time. This is not something that there are other people are quite used to. Knowing
so
that
this was early 2020.
Yeah.
Just before COVID hit.
But I also felt a kind of visibility to myself, because I recently read back some of Judith Butler's writing, where she says that occasionally she doesn't really identify as lesbian, but she would stand under the banner of lesbian if she needed to defend it. And I felt very much in that mindset too, because I felt that as perceived as a Chinese body, that Chinese identity, or that body, meant that I was in harm, or that there was that there was something that required defending. And so I then took on that identity in order to assert a presence, I suppose, because I also recognized that I had a lot of I had a big platform, because I had this kind of authoritative job title, and that I was an artist with an existing public image, and so that I had built up in other spaces a kind of level of respectability, which meant that I wasn't just a Chinese kid who was shouting on the street. And I think that was really important, because I had previously navigated the world, speaking in a particular way that got me into these other spaces. And I could now begin to shift and speak from a kind of embodied experience rather than a kind of textbook experience, I suppose.
It sounds really familiar. Around that time during COVID and Black Lives Matter, Rose Must Fall, you know, there was a point where I was kind of doing this EDI work in the background within the institution and felt very kind of invisible in doing it. And what that moment instilled in me was this idea that I had to go much more public with this, whether it was just to kind of engage with it in a kind of, you know, not a university context, but you know, a kind of real world context. And the art practice and all of these kind of other initiatives like the Artist Working Group with CFCCA, for instance, were the vehicles by which I could have a kind of activist voice and like you say, draw on the skills that I had and the position that I was holding in order to kind of get some of these ideas out there. But it was a real kind of, you know, it kind of shook me to the core, to the point where I felt compelled to do something that was not just in the background, but much more forefronted. And subsequently, you know, I feel like there's no going back. And that feels like a kind of good place in a way. Yeah.
I've heard that a lot. That's this feeling of not being able to go back. But I also think that I mean, nobody really chooses to be an activist, do they? They, you know, the reason someone is an activist is because they feel a need to be. It's not a profession that you might choose. And so I think an artist as an activist is just like any other other kind of activist who might have another role in society. They might be a teacher or a doctor or a cleaner, but they are also an activist. You don't take up this role of activist as some kind of replacement for other things that you have to do. And so I think that thinking about activism as part of our kind of daily routine as artists, as part of our daily practice as artists, feels then less obscure, because actually it undermines not only the things that we do as creative people, but just as people in general. And so then to think about these basic principles of who we are and what we do and what we care about, and our professional practices, then we start to kind of shape, they become the things that shape artistic practice. Our activism then shapes what we do professionally in a professional context, just as if you were a journalist, your politics would shape the articles that you write, or if you were a doctor, you know, your politics and your morals would shape the kinds of work that you do. So that's there's some really nice thing. People are making notes for us in the chat.
All right, okay. Really nice. Oh, that's good. So, I mean, yeah, because yeah, I remember when I was kind of in the middle of the Towards Memorial project, and some of the participants that I'd worked with were kind of activists in the city called the Friends of Edward Carpenter, and they were just trying to raise money for this kind of public memorial to Carpenter in the city centre and recognize his activism and his work, and wanted to kind of champion it. And just by circumstance of the conversation did I start to realize that, you know, some of my ideas were kind of aligning with theirs. And it was one of the key organizers of that, Kate Flannery, who leads the All Grieved Truth and Justice campaign. She described me as a kind of activist in a kind of an introduction that she was doing, and it was the first time anyone had ever put that label onto me. And I was just thinking, gosh, you know, that was a kind of an evolutionary, that was a kind of light bulb moment for me, thinking that, you know, what I was doing through the work had a kind of activism. And I like Sunshine's phrase of a kind of soft kind of activism that sort of operates through the work. And yeah, I think that, like you say, the kind of terminology is thrust upon you in as much as the racial terminology might be thrust upon you in some ways, and it's how you kind of navigate your relationship with that terminology that becomes part of the work in itself.
Yeah, you're right. And soft activism is something that me and Sunshine have been talking about a lot. But I also started thinking about activism as being applicable to everybody, even the people that don't do anything. And what would activism look like if it was applied to somebody who thinks that they're not involved in activism? And perhaps that activism is a kind of conservative activism, something that is involved in preserving the things that that exist in the ways that they are. And if that is the case, then are you an activist for the cause that you really believe in? And I think that then places a bit more responsibility on people to speak of and to enact what they believe in and what they want to see in the world. Because actually, if you're kind of coasting through the frameworks of our society without I'm trying not to use the word political, but without engaging in the without engaging in the way that it's built and the way that it shapes us and the way that it shapes realities, not only for us but the people tomorrow and the day after. If you're not engaged in that, then are you then implicitly engaged in a different kind of activism, in an activism that preserves and keeps the structures that are here at play? And I think a lot of people sit and they complain about the structures, but they don't see that they have an agency in protecting or preserving them, or maintaining the structures that are at play. And so perhaps that's a kind of radical way of reframing activism as something that everybody does, regardless of whether they're actively doing a thing.
Well, you're kind of suggesting there's no neutral position.
Yes,
which is pretty radical, isn't it? You're either doing one thing or the other, or you're not doing, by not doing anything that you allow the status quo to happen, for instance. I mean, that was definitely a feeling that I had with regards to the CFCCA, for instance. This idea that actually not being fully engaged or kind of calling it out or pointing to its problems was actually just simply accepting the status quo. And the strength of feeling that created in me that this was kind of happening, in plain sight, whilst I was living and breathing, really irked me. And it's kind of what you're saying, really. Without activism, there, non-engagement in it means you just simply accept it.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of passive acceptance. If it is, it may seem neutral to some people, but if you're an activist, then it's a challenge to you. It's a solid confrontation. And so something that is a solid confrontation is never really passive. It's something that takes work to maintain. It takes an amount of effort to not do something, to ignore something. It takes some kind of work to be able to do that. And so I do think that perhaps CFCCA felt like this year was very hard work. I don't think that they kind of just sat around and thought, oh, that was easy because we didn't do anything. So it's about where you choose to use your energies, I think.
Yeah.
And for me, that CFCCA felt like they were, that what I was met with was a confrontation in return that was framed as though it was passive, but actually was quite a solid stance. And of course, that it's not just at CFCCA, but quite often we face these kinds of barriers, even in EDI work. And quite often in when you're working with equality and diversity initiatives, perhaps surprisingly to some people, but you might then encounter a challenge that is still an attempt to maintain the structures that are at play. And I think that maybe this goes slightly back to something we were talking about before, and maybe also is in relation to the way that you work with collaborators. But we were previously, in a previous conversation, we were talking about how there is this framing of particularly in heritage sectors, of looking after something. How do you look after something? Or in community work, you might think about how you look after a community, how you look after people. And particularly as we come this year to talk so much about care in all different sectors, that looking after feels like something that is now a kind of radical act. And we were also saying that perhaps we should stop thinking about how we might look after things, but think about how we might look before, and what that means. How do you look before? How do you take care of what might come next? What is left? And this is a slightly different approach to decolonization, which focuses perhaps on what's already happened and how we start to undo narratives, how we start to undo the practices that have come before us. But to look before is perhaps to think about what kind of challenges we might face in the next year or in the next 10 years, and start to think about what modes of practice might be required in the future. And that kind of recognizes also that the future is not something that is written yet, that we don't need to be participating in the same kinds of practices that we have to put up with now. And I think that felt really evident. Particularly, you mentioned the towards memorial work earlier, and when I was watching that, I was, I think anybody working in public art, and I know there are some people in the audience who work in public art, that I mean, we were working in public artworks this year probably felt quite felt like it was quite a difficult year to be making memorials in the public. And I was looking at the 4th Plinth shortlist only last week and thinking, oh God, this is a difficult situation. But towards memorial was a way of thinking about a memorial in a different way, something that was active, something that could be taken and that wouldn't solidify. In fact, would be worn quite literally and be worn out, and then carry with it some other kind of significance for an individual.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that when I'm thinking about soft activism and thinking about these kinds of participatory artworks that are actually created through other people, I think that there's something related to that I see as a teacher, that there's something that is created with the participants in that relationship between teacher and artist, or artist and a community. Or of course we are both parts of both communities in an academy and in a community. And I wondered if maybe you could speak to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you say about this kind of to look before. I think it's a really sort of fascinating idea, because so much is kind of predicated on kind of dismantling our kind of colonial history or our pasts, for instance. I don't know whether this kind of applies in the same way, but I was watching the final, the Euro final with friends, and like you, I've never liked football, and I've always associated the England flag with a certain kind of racism or a certain kind of person. But I thought this was such a rare occasion to be kind of sitting with friends that I kind of held on to it despite not enjoying a single minute of it. And none of my jokes were landing or anything like that. Everyone was taking it far too seriously. But to understand my psychology, I was at a friend's house, which is out at the city centre of Manchester. But the whole time I was watching the match, I was preoccupied with how am I going to get from my friend's house to the city centre of Manchester to my hotel without having to come across a group of football fans who potentially might accost me or jeer me or jape me. You know, what I'd kind of historically experienced before. And that's an interesting mindset. So I was explaining this thing to my brother the next day, and he was saying, you know what, that reminds me of one of the principles of Wing Chun, which is a kind of soft martial arts. And he was saying one of the first principles of self-defense is to never get yourself in a situation where you will have trouble. So he was kind of framing it for me in a way that was like really interesting. Like, you know, that thought that I had was a kind of self-defense or self-preservation that I could do that was, you know, not to kind of, you know, put myself in harm's way. And what's interesting about that is how we occupy public space and the fear of the kind of majority. So in relationship to the Towards Memorial project and, you know, the things that were happening during Black Lives Matter, Colston statue gets dragged down, etc., etc. Simultaneously, what you have is a kind of government response, which is about the culture wars, about whether these objects should stay in public space, etc. But simultaneously, it's also about how people occupy public space. So my threat is the white majority, a crowd, you know, whereas, you know, the government's threat is the black majority in public space. And for these kind of interesting ideas to begin to sort of converge was really the thing that I was trying to kind of wrestle with in terms of the work. So by doing this kind of social engaged practice, I was realizing that all of these methods were peopling the process of the artwork. It enabled bodies to inhabit the work. And simultaneously, when you do that in relationship to public statues, is that effectively you are peopling the public space that operates around those objects, those works. So in this kind of soft activism, I am positioning social art practice as a type of alternative form of public memorial, but simultaneously giving or developing the narrative that demonizes a mass of people, a group of people being able to make a tribute to someone or to something in public space without there being this kind of heavy-handed response. So in a way, that's me responding to what you're saying there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just this morning, actually, my partner who's with me in Sheffield had a conversation with my mum about my public image, because my mum thinks that I've got enough public attention now and that I should just stop being an artist because it's getting out of hand. And I was just thinking back to this relationship with Wing Chun and thinking about how there has this mechanism of self-defense means that that they tend to avoid trouble, and my parents very much follow that line of thinking. And to be a loud activist, which I accidentally became, means that you become more and more in harm's way in some ways, because you walk down the street and you become somebody who can't not say something, or you can't not walk down the street, and because you feel like you have the right to, this sense of like a duty to walk down the street, and be visible. And I felt that also now, because my body isn't gender conforming, that I walk down the street and I'm even more visible. And so I think that differently to them, I recognize that, and I responded to my mum by saying, actually, you know, I always wanted to be a politician, but nobody trusts politicians. And actually, as an artist, I can talk about politics and people believe me more because I'm more creative than politicians are. And so they recognize that as an artist, I'm probably armed with more critical tools than a politician. And I thought that, and she was like, okay, well, we just so you know, I think you've got too much, you're too much in, you haven't got your self-defense mechanisms up, I suppose is what she was saying. And I do find that also, you know, that kind of falls into the stereotypes that are placed on us, you know, the model minority stereotype, where we are just kind of hardworking in the background. We don't cause trouble. We don't create trouble for people. That somehow the Chinese people of Chinese ethnicity do far better academically than other ethnicities, including white people. These are stereotypes that are placed on a whole range of different people. That then, when we fall out of those stereotypes, we become these kind of silent voices that don't walk in the tracks that are visible. So I suppose kind of straddling both of those is a kind of tactical move, really. Be in this to have the ability to walk in the model minority is a way of being visible, because we are visible as a model minority. We are visible as hardworking, academically gifted. You know, some people are great at piano, fine, but these are the stereotypes that are associated with an Asian body, and we are visible in those modes. But we also, as occupying that visibility, we have to then reoccupy our invisible modes as well, I think. And I think that is where the soft activism comes in. And this is perhaps also how I've justified finding myself also in an institution which I find very problematic, which is a university. And I don't know if that made any sense, but I was working through it as I'm saying it. So,
no, that totally makes sense. And it's because it kind of reminds me, especially kind of tactics, that links back to my work that I was kind of doing around the life model, because around that, I was definitely kind of very interested in how I could be this kind of seemingly passive object, but yet have a kind of activism. So I would kind of invert from the inside. And I was very much interested in kind of, you know, tactics and strategies, you know, like kind of Deserto, or, you know, structuration theory, which was about, you know, is that Giddens? I think it's Giddens. You know, you have to be in the structure in order to kind of subvert it. So very much kind of playing out some of those ideas and some of those thoughts and ideas. And it made me realize, and it kind of re-engaged a conversation that I was having recently as well with some of the artists in the artist working group about identity as a kind of method.
Yes.
You know, not one that's kind of constructed, but one that is methodological in that it kind of asserts itself or changes or adapts by circumstance, context, situation, etc. And then that reminded me of a kind of an idea of a kind of tactical ethno-nationality that an artist and academic, Susan Puisan-Locke, sort of posited in one of her essays, which was about when we were kind of when we were making our work around the 90s and early 2000s, you know, we were kind of these shifting entities as British Chinese people, because the ground under us was kind of moving so quickly. So there was a kind of short little window where, you know, we were kind of developing our kind of British Chinese sensibility alongside, you know, Black British experience and Asian British experience. And then all of a sudden there was this kind of shift from that sensibility to this kind of open market that kind of China presented to the art world. And then suddenly the focus shifted, and the priority around our own sensibilities had kind of taken a backseat. And in a way that kind of links back to, you know, one of the kind of structural reasons why CFCCA is now kind of why occupied, in that kind of shift of emphasis allowed for it through policy to develop a new position for itself.
Yeah, I see what you mean, because I think CFCCA originally was operating on the peripheries of an art discourse, and in its attempt to move to the center, it lost its ability to operate at the edges of these conversations, which all I call them ethnic minorities, but they're not really minorities. They're on the edges of a central discourse, both in all areas. And so in attempting to shift to the center rather than shift the center to them, they failed in that task of platforming a cause that was on the periphery. And I think that the way that at least I attempt to operate is to operate from the periphery and to try and bring the center there. And that's about recentering rather than centering, because it means shifting what is in the core of a discussion, and not shifting something to the core of an existing discussion. Which means that you then leave behind in the center the kind of luxuries that come with being in the center, because you're pulling something from the discussion out and you're placing it somewhere else where there aren't the resources, where there aren't the facilities and the infrastructure, but the discussion is what's valuable. And I think there's always a misalignment there, because the arts are so squashed from a funding perspective, and so the agendas get mashed together and certain things get prioritized over others, and quite often the discussion is something that is not prioritized. And we see that particularly this year, when we realize that the first thing to be sacrificed when there was a national lockdown were the people who were making art and putting on exhibitions and hanging the paintings and looking after the artworks, and that the people that were maintained were the people who were the administrators of these structures.
Yeah. And
so I think that very clearly the discussion, or what is the critical discourse, is not something that is a priority in large institutions that are at the center of artistic discourse. And largely artists are the kind of unpaid workforce that also are quite often the technicians at the same time, or the teachers, or the students, and is where the discourse is situated. And that is the kind of least of the concerns of the institutions. And I think that really we can perhaps see ourselves as a kind of institution too, and as a different mode of institution. And in doing so, we can allow ourselves to imagine what an institution could be like. When we refer to institutions, they needn't necessarily be a certain way. And if we can think about how our interactions in the studio might constitute some kind of institutional practice, community institutional practice, then we can start to rethink about what the institution could look like, what all institutions could look like if they were operating in these other kinds of modes, in a mode that centered its people, it centered the conversation. And I think that, you know, even now, like operating in this space, which feels like we've been invited here to have a space to just figure things out with an audience.
Yeah,
it feels like something that wouldn't have been possible in a different kind of context.
Yeah, because a recentering is a kind of a different kind of dispersal, you know, of power, isn't it? And to me, that kind of evokes this idea of kind of networks within networks, or kind of, you know, networks of individuals across this kind of expanse, you know. It kind of echoes, you know, migratory stories, or kind of paths of movement that are kind of from the center outwards. I mean, I remember thinking about how do we decenter the center, you know, in relationship to kind of CFCCA, as well as kind of recenter it. And one of the things that I see in kind of EDI work is how these kind of institutional structures, you know, are this kind of pyramid formation where the few get to make the most important choices, and how we need to kind of invert that structure, and how we get more voices at the point of those decision-making processes, like who gets to choose which artists, you know, gets exhibited, etc., etc. The way we can kind of people that. But one of the things that, you know, that kind of hierarchy reinforces is this idea of kind of money and expediency, and being able to kind of from the top down deliver a message to a kind of, you know, a mass of workers who kind of deliver that stuff on the ground. And whereas actually the investment needs to be in the process of inverting it to kind of support that with time, with money, with listening, with genuine engagement with communities again, to rethink essentially what those organizations are about.
Yeah, you're very right. I think quite often that the EDI strategies are managed by a small team, and even when they engage with a larger audience, there is the kind of write-up that is done by one or two people, which I find very problematic. And because the write often comes from somebody who doesn't have that embodied experience, and I know from, you know, even where there is an embodied experience of racism, or of encountering sexism or other kinds of discrimination that are related to our bodies, that there isn't a conversation that involves a majority of people who can speak to those experiences. And they might somehow it's always a kind of problem solving strategy. I think this is EDI is often a problem solving mechanism. How do we solve the issue of discrimination, sexism, and racism? How do we just correct it? And actually there isn't a need. The need is in a different kind of thinking. It's in a what we need is a real cultural shift. But in order to have a cultural shift, it's not about how you might take statistics and think about where problems exist and then address them directly. It's about rethinking how we currently operate and what inequalities they create tomorrow. And I think that is how we start to move forward with EDI questions, is not to look at who might the organization or the institution or the academy have disadvantaged over the last 20 years and how we might then compensate for it. Actually think about what things are we doing now that are going to create inequalities. And I think that's where EDI strategy should really be targeted, in what we might be inadvertently creating for the world tomorrow. But actually a lot of the conversation isn't related to that, it's about how often also it's about how good it looks, because there's charter marks and awards that look great if you can get them, and they are also not evidence of good practice. They're just evidence of some practice.
It's interesting because that really kind of evokes this idea of how, you know, arts organizations are within themselves, within a kind of structure of other organizations, and how the structural inequalities kind of go beyond what the institution does, in that, you know, it's implicated in a wider context. It's a wider infrastructure that kind of holds that institution in place. So these are the things that you have to kind of decipher in terms of how you know, decolonize that organization as well. What's kind of allowed it to exist the way that it has done. And it takes a while to kind of decipher some of those things. And not to say that we, you know, that we're kind of simultaneously kind of doing that ourselves in to some degree. And I do like this idea of kind of, you know, how arts organizations are, they're ideologically positioned, but ultimately it's who works in those organizations that kind of exercise their agency and also enforce or reinforce certain ideologies played out through the institution. There's a, you know, we can't just simply blame the organization and just dismantle the building. Like we can't just take down the statue because the history and the hurt or the ideologies still exist. Yeah, because I often think how kind of monuments are a kind of, you know, a folly, so that we pull the statue down rather than, you know, bang on the walls of, you know, government and, you know, knock the walls of parliament down, sort of thing. You know, it's a kind of, you know, it's a, let them have their argument over there, and we're, you know, the ideology is still safe here, locked away. And I think there's something about that relationship that's quite well, not simply curious, but it's a real thing that is being tackled.
Can I just jump in here really quick?
Yeah.
I also realized that there are about 20 minutes left of this conversation that has gone by so quickly. And there's some... I know.
I thought it started at 8:30. This was just a pre-chat.
This is just the precursor. This is all just in answering that first question about giving some biographical context in your practice, and possible intersection points between your practices. But no, sadly, we only have about 20 minutes left. But so if it's okay, I'd like to kind of maybe bring our attention to some of the questions that's been really quite interesting, that's been brought up in the chat. So maybe I can go to the first one. Alex Beeston was asking about has the last 20 years, the economic blossoming of China in the last 20 years, changed the experience within the UK Art University for the Chinese student? And what that wider experience of this, what I guess what is, maybe it's just a typo there, what is the wider experience of this within the panel?
Is that for the mainland Chinese students, or is that for the British Chinese students?
That's also something that's easily conflated, and I think it goes back to what JJ was saying earlier about that. You know, your identity is not necessarily what you kind of conceive it to be, but rather outside perception sort of being placed upon you, and then you having to contend with that, you know.
Well, I generally meant from the mainland.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
I'm going to kind of speak around it because I don't know how to directly answer that question, but the economic growth of China has obviously shaped politics all over the world, but also in the same way as the economic decline of other places. And so there was in British politics a real engagement with the economic rise of China in the last like 10, 20 years. And part of the Chancellor George Osborne a few years ago, his strategy for the Northern Powerhouse was to involve more Chinese investment in the north, particularly in areas like Manchester. And CFCCA were quite involved in that. In fact, they launched I think they launched the Northern Powerhouse campaign from there. They co-hosted the launch event. And so in terms of arts, and if we're thinking about how global politics and British policy in accordance to global politics has shifted our experience as artists, then certainly there is that we have been kind of roped into that, whether we are kind of willing participants or not. And I think that's quite important to remember, whether we are participants of the systems that we find ourselves in, whether we want to be or not. And that kind of goes back to thinking about how institutions are these collectives of individuals who do shape the infrastructures around them, who do choose to be in the center or on the peripheries. But maybe I'll also point you to an essay by Morgan Quaintance called Looking Back in Anger, which looks back at the kind of 10 years of conservative policy that has shaped the UK art scene, including of British Chinese artists. And if I kind of speak to the experience of Chinese students from mainland China in the UK, I'm not a Chinese student, so it's very difficult for me to kind of speak to that. But they are increasingly visible, of course, because of in the same ways that me and Yen have felt increasingly visible. And a lot of them arrive in the UK without an understanding of what it means to walk down the street and encounter racism, and to come to the UK in the middle of a racialized pandemic, where our bodies are perceived as viruses, is a very difficult time to be entering into this kind of society. And so that's the experience that I have witnessed with students. But in relation to economics, and I think perhaps it does have quite a lot to do with economics anyway, but in relation to the kind of boom of economic boom of China, and us seeing more and more students from East Asia come to study with us, that hasn't, I suppose it's the question, has it shaped the way that we operate, and has it shaped the way that we teach? Is of course, the demographic of the students and the background and the context of the students does shape the way that we teach, because actually we teach as a community. They teach us as much as we teach them. And so we operate as a community of practice, and that is the only way really that you can teach artists to be. So I don't know whether that really answers the question, because I kind of spoke around it on related topics. But maybe, Yen, do you have something to add to that, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what kind of Sunshine was saying about how the international Chinese student experience is often conflated with, the British Chinese experience, and how that sometimes can be kind of disguised or negated, or kind of, pushed to the margins a little bit. Because the university is so intent on, developing its links with China, and, kind of aligning itself with that from a kind of economic point of view. But then how it kind of deals, how it kind of fares with myself is quite sort of nuanced, really. It's not a straightforward way of kind of responding, because I've simultaneously been kind of excluded by Chinese institutions in Hong Kong or China to do an exchange, because I'm not a white academic with a beard, and and because there's a propensity in Chinese institutions to kind of make visible their international guests almost like kind of superstars. You know, they make posters from out of them, and it's this idea that they are not perceived as being kind of inward looking themselves. Some of my other gripes with that dynamic a little bit is that, you know, in the institution that I work at, we have this kind of hall of fame of kind of, you know, all the academics who've been kind of awarded a kind of, you know, inspirational teacher here or academic leader here. And there was obviously a real lack of kind of diversity in one year. And they put up this poster, which was all their partners within different institutions across the world. And they championed them. And this created an exclusion for me because, you know, these academics hadn't experienced the sort of the marginalized discourse around my British experience as a British Chinese person. And I kind of thought, God, that's kind of making me feel kind of invisible in this moment. And yet it was a kind of championing that was, you know, that had kind of echoes of sort of colonialism, you know, and that made me kind of rethink my own position. So it's a funny one. It's a funny one because I kind of also relate that back to some of my early working relationships with kind of mainland Chinese artists who were coming over to the UK and doing their projects for the first time. And there was this kind of perception of me as being kind of slightly inauthentic or mute or, you know, slightly not the real deal. And some of that kind of feeling still carries. So yeah, that
was great. Anyway, thank you.
Not being the real deal, kind of on both fronts or in every which way.
Yeah, like funnily enough as well, I was just going through exhibitions that I could remember that were of kind of British Chinese or kind of the China explosion, and one of them was called The Real Thing, that was curated at the Tate Liverpool, and it was trying to kind of position itself within China, that this was the real thing, that was a kind of a backlash to this kind of Coca-Cola pop sensibility that was kind of infiltrating the commercial market at the time. However, when that show landed, you know, the British Chinese community were kind of looking at each other and thinking, God, this is a real statement here, that it felt like our inauthenticness was somehow the thing that positioned the real thing in relationship to Chinese artists. It's so complicated, and that is a piece of work to be done, to look at the ideological positioning on some of that work that was being done during that time. And yeah, that will just make for fascinating reading, I think.
I think when it comes to the talking about Chinese artists or Chinese students, there's inevitably this homogenization of context. Not only there's not only a kind of homogenization of students who are from China and the Chinese diaspora, which are from multiple contexts across the world, but also within China there are multiple economic different contexts, differing contexts and identities. China is massive, and people come with different kinds of resources. And I think that it's really important for, at least for the university, to recognize that that's the case, because often the marketing strategy is aimed at places where there is a sense that there is a kind of economic, I don't know what, blossoming is the word that Alex used, because there is a need to develop income strategies for the institution. But actually that we've got to remember that people come from very different contexts, and they come from all over the world, and we might still, when they arrive, see them in their as East Asian bodies, and as such treat them in in a particular way.
Mm.
And I think that is not just something that we're in danger of, but is something that institutions and organizations and individuals do currently.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, just even thinking about all these like gradations, valences of Chineseness, I'm thinking about the term Chinese in Cantonese. There's 中国人, which is like literally a person from China. And then you've got Hua Qiu or Hua Yan, which doesn't allude to China as a nation, but rather this sort of cultural amalgam of being Chinese, which doesn't translate in English because there is no concept of Hua Yan or Hua Qiu. But yeah.
I just thought about Hakayan, which is a kind of guest family, isn't it? Is that Haka? Yeah. It's like guest families.
Because Hakayan were nomadic or kind of not.
Or they were displaced, I suppose, from where they were.
That's so right. They're not kind of really
area of China.
Are you Hakka as well?
Yeah. And
so I'm also Hakka. So we're all Cantonese Hakka mixtures.
Yeah. And much of the global Chinese diaspora are, I think, because there is a perhaps inherited sense of the nomadic that has or a kind of sensibility for being agile, having an agility to adapt to something that is not built for you somehow, that you're always recognized as a guest rather than as someone who belongs.
Can I just, because with the 5 minutes left at the end, there are two really good questions I'd like to at least touch upon. Maybe I can try and combine them. One is from Wing Shan and one is from Angela Chan. Hi, both of you. Wing Shan asks how you protect yourself as someone who has lived racialized, I think she means racialized, not radicalized experiences, don't you think? I don't know if you can see it in the chat.
Yes, definitely racialized.
Great, thanks, Wing Shan. Has lived racialized experiences when doing the hard labor and emotional labor of EDI. And then Angela is also asking, in a similar vein, but more generally, what are some exciting and nourishing ways that you'd like to continue doing this? Archiving. Oh, sorry. I kind of skipped to the question without reading the context. Sorry, Angela. So the context is reinstating that we're working in the peripheries. It's even more important to self-archive our activities and strategies with each other and our allies in other similar peripheries for the us in the peripheries to come. So what are some exciting and nourishing ways you'd like to continue doing this? I feel like there is some way that maybe we can do.
I mean, when I first started kind of doing EDI work, I felt the emotional labor first, I think, because I was kind of decolonizing myself to a certain degree, while simultaneously in the process of trying to decolonize the institution. So I couldn't just fold the laptop down and step away from the work, because my body or my embodiment of those ideas were completely implicit in them. So I couldn't step away from them. And, you know, in the early days of the kind of artist working group as well, you know, I felt very strongly that my identity was somehow wrapped up in this organization's very existence. If it existed, therefore it meant that I existed. But then suddenly there was a real change. There was almost like a kind of breaking of the sort of primal link there somehow. Not only was the organization failing for me, you know, but you know, because it kind of it changed. It becomes something else, and I think a healthy amount of othering from my individual sense of self in relationship to the organization is good for kind of being able to do the EDI work when I do feel the impact of what it does, if that makes sense. And then I found solace in making art that became more and more politicized, and it had an audience and a realm that could do more than what I was doing within the institution. So, you know, it was about bridging that gap as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I too felt very alone when I started. I suppose started a very officially started, I suppose, EDI work. I was working at the RCA, and I put myself forward to be on this panel, which was a national panel for tackling racial discrimination in higher education. I was the only person from the RCA to put myself forward, and I don't think they even know that I did it. Even now, after the work has been done and it's been published. But I think that I felt very alone in doing that work. And I felt very reasonably alone when I wrote that open letter. I lost a lot of confidence that year because I didn't do any other exhibitions that year. I turned everything down. And in fact, this invitation from Sunshine was one of the only things that I was one of the first things that I accepted doing, because I had really lost faith in the structures that I saw were around me as an artist, and I was desperately looking for some other way to be an artist, because I knew that from I knew that existed somehow, that you could be an artist and not be participating in this kind of art world, that there were multiple kinds of art worlds to participate in, but I hadn't quite found it. And I think that now I approach EDI work and activism and any kind of conversation about race as an artist. I use the tools of art practice to be able to talk about them. I use the knowledge and the theories and the books that I read as an artist to be able to speak from a different vocabulary. And that enables me to have people who listen, because I am not a critical race scholar, so I can't speak as though I have spent years reading critical race theory and can write and can come up with new strategies for the future of our societies. But I can speak as an artist. And as an artist, we have a different set of tools. And from that perspective, and also inherently being an activist, just because of the body that I'm in, then we can think of it as part of our daily practice, or of the work that we already do. And so there is a sense that the pressure of I certainly don't set out to make work that is intentionally activist work, and I certainly don't set out to in any of thing I do, whether it's an exhibition or a piece of writing, I don't write as though I'm a kind of critical race scholar or somebody who knows a lot about discussions on race. I can only speak from my own experience as an artist, and I think that there is a need and you've got to recognize that there's value in that, and that there's not only value in being an artist, but there are values in being other kinds of roles in society that you can speak from too. And that takes off the pressure a little bit, because it's work that you need to do anyway. And I think perhaps one of the most important things to have around you is friends, because I realize that friendship is something that we can frame as a methodology of practice, because friendship encompasses some of the things that we are now calling radical, which I think is quite a shocking revelation, that these things are radical, such as care or generosity or kindness or trust. Somehow these things are now radical acts, but they're the basic necessities of a decent friendship. And so friendship is this way of building a support structure around you of peers who can support you in your activism, platform your voice alongside you to help make and imagine the ideas that you've got for challenging the way that we imagine ourselves in the future, or the way that we might imagine worlds in the future. And so I make all of my work now involves other people, involves working in collaboration with friends or my partner or my parents or friends that I only just meet, like Sunshine. So, one of the tasks that we had set for the residency was to make friends with the block studio holders. And that was something that was really important to us, because I felt that I couldn't participate in a residency with an organization and not be friends with its neighbors, because it wouldn't be possible to work in a context without friends. And so that was one of the things that we really is nourishing and exciting.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And I kind of echo that. I don't think I'd be here in this moment without the other members of the artist working group. Elins, I think, is in the audience. And because, their energy and focus and courageousness rubbed off on me, because I had a kind of personal stake in the organization, because it kind of informed so much of my kind of early career. And there were people, and they were friends. They were real friends with some of the board members, for example. And those friendships were never going to be tested because of, this particular instance. But it was the first time that we had to have that conversation about where did our friendship lie in the wake of everything that had happened with the CFCCA. And again, it kind of reinstates this idea that having this kind of critical distance from the institution is kind of a good thing, that kind of ultimately, people in these situations, I don't know whether I'm going to say something provocative here or not, but maybe it's just me wanting to see the humanity in all of this, because ultimately what this problem around EDI is kind of setting about is that we all want to see ourselves reflected in the institutions that we engage with. And it's that mimetic impulse back, and to share, and is to find ourselves in each other. And I think that is one of the fundamental principles by which I do this work. So I have an idea of myself, this kind of decolonized self that I want to meet at some point in my lifetime.
Yeah, no, I do. Yeah, because in some ways it does still feel very solitary, and I mean, we recognize that every action that we do creates realities for other people, and for ourselves, and so implicitly we aren't alone in anything that we do, because it creates the realities for others always. But it does feel like sometimes that that work is a tough hill to climb on without friends along the way. Yeah. And so and I see a lot of friends in this audience too, which is great. And actually, we spoke about doing this previously, Sunshine, but I know we're over time. But maybe we can end the recording, and we can see if anybody has any questions that they would have not wanted to ask on record, and we'd be happy to kind of look to them if anyone wants to turn their camera on and ask anything that they would rather not be on YouTube afterwards.